Alrighty guys, it's time to talk about something a little different today, and that's the lore of ATF, specifically the holes and gray areas in it. Now let me start with droids, pre-flash androids to be exact, because the technology guide doesn't state them anywhere, and the droid section altogether is pretty lackluster with just a paragraph. But androids would make perfect sense on a military and commercial aspect, as militaries would make droids look like people to confuse the enemy about who they're really up against or to inflate their numbers, similarly to how the Allies used dummy tanks in World War II. They could even use them to bait enemies into firing, giving away their position, because they think they're attacking a person and not just a disposable droid. You would also see droids being used commercially in order to not freak people out with the idea that robots are taking over people's jobs. You could have a droid cashier that looks like a person and acts like a person, so it's really hard to tell the difference. Then it wouldn't freak people out as much because they just wouldn't know. Now let me talk about post-flash androids, because I think they would make even more sense than the pre-flash ones. And that's the fact that droids would most likely disguise themselves as humans in order to avoid harassment, discrimination, and overall distrust that people have with droids. And it wouldn't be hard for a droid to replace their parts, like their head, to give them a more human-like shape to them, as it can be assumed that droids were made with swappable parts, just like any other machine. And if you read the technology guide, you would see that prosthetics were becoming quite advanced by 2071, so it's safe to assume that some sort of fake skin was created for the purpose of covering up prosthetics so they don't freak people out or make the user feel like they still have their true limbs. Fake skin could even be used to cover up burns or other kinds of scars. And we can assume that this fake skin could be easily made using those large 3D printers that are still being used in the wasteland, just like the ones that you see in Maker's factory. You can easily assume this because since they can print out metal and other alloys, fake skin totally doesn't seem out of the question. Now, of course, you could say that that all sounds fine on paper, but the implementation of trying to reconstruct a droid, obtain good fake skin, and putting it on correctly wouldn't work out too well. And of course, that is true, but you know what they could definitely pass off as? Mutants. Mutants have disformities and rougher skin, so if a droid didn't get everything 100% right, then that would be fine because that issue could be easily waved off as them just being a mutant. Now you may be asking, why would a droid want to be a mutant? Because instead of fixing their problems, wouldn't they just be adding more? While that is true, there are still benefits for droids disguising themselves among mutants. One of the main things is getting the protection and resources of mutant-friendly factions such as South Point. Now you may be asking, why don't droids then do what South Point did and form their own faction to protect themselves? And the main reason they haven't is because there are very few free-roaming droids at this point. In those 90 years since the Flash, it is safe to assume that many of these droids that were out there have been destroyed, and the very few that are either being built or put together aren't being made or repaired for the sake of just letting them go free. They are probably going to be used by some faction, so in the end, there just is not enough droids out there to form their own faction. So even though South Point is getting prosecuted by a lot of people, it is still better than being alone out in the wasteland. Now on to my next point, which I kind of alluded to just before this, which is the relationship between humans and droids, which I think would probably be a similar situation to humans and mutants, which is general mistrust, discrimination, and even violence. These tensions could have been created over the 90 years. Both sides would have seen themselves as superior and the other ones as inferior. And also fear among the droids could be spread about all humans want to do is use them as disposable tools, which could have actually been something that people did, as droids can do laboring jobs much better than humans can, as they only need to be recharged and their parts can be replaced. So this fear could turn violent, roping in outsiders into this conflict, escalating things more until the present day where there's some kind of tension that is still felt. But enough about droids, let's move on to something else that's only mentioned in a couple of the After Flash guides, and that's radstorms. For the people that don't know what radstorms are basically sandstorms, but instead of sand, it's radioactive particles. These radstorms are extremely deadly to humans, mutants, and droids, and will cause symptoms associated with radiation poisoning, which includes death and cancer on the extreme end. Now, this brings up the whole issue that those radioactive particles probably aren't going to stay in the air, and some of them are going to get deposited wherever those rad storms go, just like regular sandstorms. Meaning after a rad storm blows through, it is still not safe to go outside because there are still radioactive materials everywhere, even in places like Bardstown and the alumni campus. One of the biggest issues with radioactive material getting left everywhere is the fact that it's going to get into the water and crops. If radioactive material is getting deposited into the waters of Lake Erie, then it would make the water extremely dangerous to drink and hard to filter than just using purification tablets and especially just boiling it, as boiling it would make those radioactive particles go back into the air, allowing you to inhale them, making them much more dangerous. And this means that you can't just eat crops that were grown outside because they either have radioactive material on them which you need to wash off, or the soil they grew in has radioactive material in it and the crops would absorb that radioactive material through the roots, making it so you can't even wash those off. Now, if that wasn't bad enough, let me bring up another issue, and that's what does the wildlife do on the island when there's a rad storm? Like, think about it. They can't put a gas mask on or go inside an airtight building during a rad storm, and they're also trapped on the island, so they're just stuck out in the rad storm. And like I mentioned earlier, rad storms will kill you if you're exposed to them long enough. And the same would definitely go for animals. So there probably isn't that many animals even alive on the island. Let me take it a step even further and ask, how are the plants gonna survive? Because radiation also kills plants. So if a rad storm blew through, it would probably kill the plants as well. In fact, there's a really good real-world comparison, which is the Red Forest in Chernobyl, where when the reactor blew up, a lot of radioactive dust got launched into the air and then settled back down into this red forest, killing most of the trees. And this event is extremely similar to just what a rad storm is, which is a bunch of radioactive particles in the air that cruise along and then eventually settle down somewhere. Alrighty guys, that's the end of the video. I hope you guys enjoyed, and I know this one is quite different from my normal videos, but I just wanted to put this out there to see if we could get a response from the ATF devs about these, and bring some awareness to these gray areas in the ATF lore. There will be a part 2, because I got a few more things I gotta talk about, and yeah, I'll see you around.